turn now to a second set of comments on the book by E.M. Forster, which I had considered in my previous talk, A Passage to India, a novel published in 1924. And just to recapitulate very briefly some elements of the plot and some of the observation that I had made in the first half of this discussion about this book. So the plot essentially unfolds in the following fashion: that you have an English woman by the name of Mrs. Moore, an elderly woman, and a younger woman by the name of Adela Quested, who come to India. They hope to see the real India, but Adela has also come to India because she is engaged to Ronnie Heslop, who is the city magistrate in a fictional town by the name of Chandrapur. And she wants to, meet with Ronnie and get the sense of things. She's obviously eager to understand, if one may put it this way, the circumstances under which the British are living in India. I suppose the supposition on her part also is that if she were to get engaged to, if she were to get married to Ronnie Heslop, that she would herself be living in India. So during the course of their stay, very early on, they get introduced to a set of characters. Among them is an Englishman by the name of Fielding, who is not at all liked by the other English, partly because he's a man of liberal disposition. He tends to consort with the Indians, he mixes with them. And the English, of course, observe something like a caste system in India. As I've said on many an occasion, one can even see the English as having out-Brahmined the Brahmins in some fundamental respects, including their fear of contamination and pollution by close proximity to the Indians. Now, one of the other characters that they meet is an Indian doctor. He, in fact, actually is the central character of the book. His name is Dr. Aziz. And Dr. Aziz invites Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore to accompany him to an expedition to the Marabar caves. And during the course of that trip, when they go to a second set of caves, so there's a first set of caves that they go to, and at that point, Mrs. Moore asks to be excused because it's rather hot. It's somewhat claustrophobic. There's a large number of Indians there as well. And she suggests to Dr. Aziz and Adela that they should actually go to the second set of caves all by themselves, accompanied only by a guide, which they do so. And something happens there. What really happens is nothing more than the fact that Adela has something like a hallucination, but she believes that she's been sexually molested, perhaps raped by Dr. Aziz. And in consequence of the charge that she agrees to level against him, Dr. Aziz is put on trial, and eventually, during it's a short trial presided over by an Indian. The circumstances under which he presides over it is something I'll get to in just a few moments. But during the course of that short trial, Dr. Aziz is acquitted without any stain on his honor. And towards the end of the novel, we find that Fielding, that Dr. Aziz has moved to Kashmir. He wants to escape everything that has happened in Chandrapur. He's escaped to Kashmir, or at least that's how it's shown in the film made by David Lean, which is certainly worth watching. It's described as a place called Mao in the book here. So he's gone there, and Fielding catches up with him over there after a number of years. He, in fact, actually has married Mrs. Moore's daughter, although Dr. Aziz had been led to believe by some of his friends that Fielding, in fact, had actually married Adela Quested, something, of course, which Dr. Aziz had considered to be extremely unpleasant, and in fact a betrayal by Fielding, because he viewed Fielding as a friend. So for Fielding to have married, as Dr. Aziz thought, the woman who had leveled a false charge against him was something, of course, that was entirely unacceptable to Aziz. but in the event he is mistaken about this. But nevertheless, it transpires towards the end of the book that Dr. Aziz says to Fielding that, well, I don't think really friendship is really possible between the two of us, not until at least colonialism has disappeared, not until at least the British are no longer in India as the rulers. Now, I think that there are many ways in which one can think about the book. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned is that there are a number of criticisms that have been leveled against the book. Of course, the book has a large number of admirers, and one of its greatest admirers was Lionel Trilling, a very how should I put it, a very creative intellectual, literary critic of an earlier generation. I mean, sadly, he's not read very much these days. I hope that in the course of these talks, if they continue over several months and perhaps going into a couple of years, that I'll have occasion to talk about at least one of Lionel Trilling's books, a book called Sincerity and Authenticity, which I think is a very lucid expression of some of his ideas. But Trilling was of the view that when one reads novels by Forster, that every time one reads his novels, one discovers something new. Of course, that's something that has been said about a great many other novelists. But Trilling was quite adamant in his view that this was certainly true of Forster and was true of every novel that Forster had written. I don't think that Forster, and I'm quite sure that there would be general agreement with what I'm saying. I don't think that Forster is viewed as someone who belongs in the company of, let's say, the giants of Russian literature, such as Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, nor is he seen as being in the company of, let's say, Melville, as if one is thinking of Moby Dick, or if one is thinking of Proust, Remembrance of Things Past. I mean, these are viewed as really magisterial novels, which offer us great insights into the psychology of human conduct, into the nature of social relations. I don't think Forster is generally put in that category. He's perhaps seen as someone who belongs in a somewhat lower tier, uh, but I think of him really as a novelist in many respects. And my own view is that a passage to India uh, is a novel which offers us, as far as literary treatments of colonialism are concerned, perhaps the most incisive views about the nature of the relationship between the British and Indians, because that really is the subject matter of the book. What was the nature of the interaction between the Indians and the English, right? And of course, under the rubric of that, one can also entertain ideas such as, well, what was the English view of Muslims? What was the English view of Hindus? Right? Which is not to say that Forster offers any kind of account of whether the British were responsible for separatism, for creating the communal divide, as some people would allege, between Hindus and Muslims. In fact, one of the criticisms that has been leveled against Forster is that he seems to, in fact, view the Hindus and the Muslims as belonging to two different universes, or as Jinnah might have said, they're actually two separate nations. And one of the other criticisms that has been leveled against uh, Forster's novel is the argument that that he puts forward the idea of a kind of an exotic, mysterious India. That this was, the predominant image in many respects that was circulating in the West. However, to convey the nuances of what he's saying and the the stylistic elegance of his observations, right? So we can have sociologists and historians who might write about social relations between the two, but I think the manner in which Forster depicts them suggests something quite different than what the social scientist or what the scholar might do. Um, so I'm going to take very briefly a few passages into consideration over here. And this is Forster's description of Fielding, who, as I've mentioned, is an Englishman who has been more or less outcasted by his fellow Englishmen and English women. He is a member of the club. So the club is this private institution, very much a British enclave, a safe space, as to use a common idiom of our times. They certainly thought of it perhaps as a safe space. But I think a more interesting way to think of it is as a little England, right? Let us not forget that England was itself a country that was, in fact, actually stricken by what one would describe as divisions of class and caste, in a manner of speaking. So this is what Forster says about Fielding. Still, the men tolerated him for the sake of his good heart and strong body. It was their wives who decided that he was not a sahib, really. They disliked him. He took no notice of them, and this, which would have passed without comment in feminist England, did him harm in a community where the male is expected to be lively and helpful. Now we should pause, over a comment like this, because I think if we read, for example, when he says that they disliked him, he took no notice of them, so he's completely indifferent to them. Um, and Forster is suggesting that, well, in feminist England, which is by no means that England was really feminist or that feminism had become the predominant uh, ideology in England, certainly not in the early 1920s, and Forster is well aware of that. But what he means is that, well, the supposition there in England is that, on the part of many women, is that if there happens to be a man who's indifferent to them, well, that's how it is. Well and good, right? Perhaps it's even for the better. We're being left alone. Right? But in India, this did harm in a community where the male is expected to be lively and helpful. This is how men make themselves useful to women in a country like India, which is demanding, where the female is even more vulnerable. Women may be vulnerable everywhere. Uh, they may be vulnerable to sexual assault. They may be vulnerable to the male gaze, to predators. Right? But in India, they're especially vulnerable. They're especially vulnerable. It's foreign terrain. They're in a minority, and they've been put on a pedestal. They've been put on a pedestal. So this is what Forster is implying. Mr. Fielding never advised one about dogs or horses. I think wonderful humor here, right? Because of course, if you had to think of, England, you have to think of dogs and horses. I mean, the two animals that the English keep on talking about all the time, along with the weather, right? Mr. Fielding never advised one about dogs or horses, or dined, or paid his midday calls. So you really have to know the nature of British social life in India, because this was very, very common. That you paid a call during the midday, and then you left a little card if the person you were visiting wasn't there. You did the rounds. And what else, of course, was there for the English to do if they were not governing in India? Right? Or decorated trees for one's children at Christmas. Let me read that sentence again. Mr. Fielding never advised one, so these are all his faults, right? Never advised one about dogs or horses, or dined, or paid his midday calls, or decorated trees for one's children at Christmas. And though he came to the club, it was only to get his tennis or billiards and to go, not to gossip, not to linger around. This was true. So he has a long sentence invariably followed by a very short sentence. Notice the previous, right? How it started. Still, the men tolerated him for the sake of his good heart and strong body. It was their wives, semicolon, it was their wives who decided that he was not a sahib really. Period. They disliked him, period. Short sentence. Long sentence followed by very, very short sentence. We see that again in the passage that I cited. He had discovered that it is possible to keep in with Indians and English men, but that he who would also keep in with English women must drop the Indians. The two wouldn't combine, right? And this is where some of the critics, particularly feminist critics today, have suggested that, well, there seems to be an element of sexism, perhaps even misogyny. I think that would certainly be overstating it, but certainly an element of sexism, because the supposition on Forster's part seems to be, and this is how the narrator is coming across to us, that English women in particularly were really intolerable. They were intolerable because um, they had certain expectations of their own men there, and the men who refused to comply uh, were people who really had betrayed the race, right? And then, of course, feeling really mixes with Indians, right? And this is really intolerable to English women. English men might still accept it under certain circumstances, not simply because they have to work with the Indians, but there is a different spirit of fellowship among men, which is not really prevalent here among women. Right? So this is something that gives us some insight into how Forster is thinking about the English in India. But if the gist of the book really is the relations between the Indians and the English, the British more widely, because there would have been Scots and Irish as well, right? Then I think we need to look perhaps at some other passage. And um, the passage that comes to mind is one that is also from the chapter called Mosque. So this is the first long uh, part. So I think one can, rather than using the word chapter, I should simply use parts, which is what Forster himself did. So the first part of the novel is Mosque. The second part is Caves. And then we have part three called Temple. Uh, Now, in this passage here, so the occasion for this conversation that comes is that uh, Fielding has decided to put together a party. This is before, of course, the expedition to the caves, and Aziz has been invited to his home, and then Fielding informs him that, well, I've invited two English ladies as well. Uh, and Aziz says, really, I don't think I really know any English lady. He says, well, you do know them. I mean, you know Mrs. Moore, because Dr. Aziz had actually, his first encounter with Mrs. Moore was at a mosque. So it's a very interesting encounter there, but I'm going to have to overlook that for the present. Uh, and so, and then when Fielding mentions these names, then Aziz says, oh yes, I remember. The romance at the mosque had sunk out of his consciousness as soon as it was over. An excessively aged lady. But will you please repeat the name of her companion? Miss Quested, says Fielding. Just as you wish. He was disappointed that other guests were coming. That is, Aziz was disappointed, for he preferred to be alone with his new friend, Fielding. You can talk to Miss Quested, says Fielding, about the peacock throne if you like. She's artistic, they say. And then Aziz says, is she a post-impressionist? Post-impressionism, indeed. Come along to tea. This word is getting too much for me altogether. End quote. This is Fielding's rejoinder. And now here's the narrator coming in. Aziz was offended. The remark suggested that he, an obscure Indian, had no right to have heard of post-impressionism, a privilege reserved for the ruling race. That, he said stiffly, I do not consider Mrs. Moore my friend. I only met her accidentally in my mosque, and was adding, a single meeting is too short to make a friend. But before he could finish the sentence, the stiffness vanished from it. because he felt Fielding's fundamental goodwill. His own went out to it and grappled beneath the shifting tides of emotion, which can alone bear the voyager to an anchorage, but may also carry him across it onto the rocks. He was a he was safe, really, as safe as a shore dweller who can only understand stability and supposes that every ship must be wrecked. And he had sensations the shore dweller cannot know. And before I continue with the rest of this critical passage, it's very interesting because this whole metaphor of voyaging and across the seas and the shore dweller and the boat, as it were, hitting the shore. This is very much prevalent, of course, also in Bhakti poetry. Indeed, he was sensitive rather than responsive. In every remark, he found a meaning, but not always the true meaning. And his life, though vivid, was largely a dream. Right? So here, Forster may well be falling into some kind of what scholars would call Orientalism, right? The Orient is kind of a dream that the Oriental, in this case, an Indian Muslim, lives in a dreamlike world. But let's notice the next set of observations. Fielding, for instance, had not meant that Indians are obscure, but that post-impressionism is. A gulf divided his remark from Mrs. Turton's, "Why, they speak English." But to Aziz, the two sounded alike. I think that this is critically important. And Mrs. Turton, of course, is one of these English women who are living there, very condescending and patronizing, will have nothing to do with the Indians, of course, and is astonished to run into Indians who speak English, which is why she run into Indians who speak English, which is why she will make observations something to this effect. Why they speak English, right? With this tone of astonishment, and clearly condescending. And what Forster is saying is that the tenor of that remark is very different than Fielding's observation when Aziz asked, "Is she a post-impressionist?" And Fielding said, "Post-impressionism, indeed. Come along to tea. This world is getting too much for me altogether." Because the tenor of that remark is not so much that, well, hey, I'm really astonished, Aziz, that you know something about post-impressionism. Rather, it is that post-impressionism, well, isn't that something that is really a little too fashionable? Right? That's the tenor of that remark. So what do we make of this? What we make of it is very simply this, that Forster is suggesting that, look, when we are assessing the colonial encounter and the conversations between the Indians and the English, to the extent that any took place, there is a gap there. There are misunderstandings. Because, of course, a speech utterance, to take one simple instance, is not simply comprised of the words, but it's very much informed by the tone, by the affect. And whether the idioms and the nuances of all of this are present in the mind of the listener, particularly when the listener has to cross the culture, so to speak, right? That's an open question. So what Forster is really speaking about is the difficulties of translation. And here, of course, one doesn't mean translation literally, but rather how does one translate from a culture to another? And therefore, what Forster is also thinking about is what are the possibilities of real and interculturality? Interculturality is where one lives between cultures and sometimes lives so comfortably between cultures that one is really not even aware of how one transitions from one culture to another, of or whether in fact one can say that this is what is distinct to one culture and this is distinct to the other. Right? One lives between them with a kind of familiarity and ease. And I think Forster's suggestion here in this novel is that this almost was never achieved, perhaps only by a handful of people, both on the English side and on the Indian side. And so that brings me then to the third and final um, passage that I really want to look at. And this is from the part called Caves. So this is during the course of their trial. Um, and the trial is being prosecuted here by Mr. McBride. So he is the police superintendent of Chandrapur. Ronnie Heslop has an assistant. His name is Dr. Das, and Dr. Das is the person who is going to be asked to uh, preside over the trial. Why? Because Heslop decides that he is going to actually excuse himself or recuse himself, I should say, and he should recuse himself because, of course, he's an interested party. Uh, the woman who has made the charge or the allegation against Aziz is engaged to be married to him, and he's a city magistrate, and if he should happen to preside over the trial, naturally there would be some suspicion. Now this is whether the accused would get a fair trial, and of course one of the things that Forster is saying is that look, I mean, uh, uh, the bulwark, the foundation of British, the pillar of British rule in India was the claim that we alone are able to put India under the sign of the rule of law. That that under the British, it's a level playing field, or certainly the idea of fair play is an idea that we English are deeply committed to. Now, this is not Forster's view. What he's suggesting is that Heslop recuses himself because he wants to live up to this ideal, right? And he wants to live up to this ideal and suggest to the Indians, well, look how we practice it. That though I could have presided over this trial, I've decided, in fact, um, that I'm going to turn it over to my Indian assistant. So let's just look at this passage over here. Um, Mr. McBride was not at pains to be an interesting speaker. He left eloquence to the defense, who would require it, right? So again, this is wonderful little comment by Forster, um, um, because here what he's also suggesting is that look, ordinarily one is innocent until proven guilty, but in fact, of course, the English took the view that he is guilty. Dr. Aziz is guilty, and therefore, of course, the Indians are going to require everything that they can muster, right? Including eloquence. His attitude was McBride's, he's the prosecutor, everyone knows the man's guilty, and I am obliged to say so in public before he goes to the Andamans, right? The Kalapani, the Andamans was where you were sent. Political prisoners in particular were sent across the seas, right, to the cellular jail for uh, the most egregious offenses. Right? He made no moral or emotional appeal, and it was only by degrees that the studied negligence of his manner made itself felt and lashed part of the audience to fury, because the bulk of the audience, of course, is Indian. And they can see in McBride's conduct of this trial the arrogance, right? The supposition that, well, this trial is simply being conducted because we have to show to India that a man gets a trial when he's charged. But we all know he's guilty. And surely the court cannot find him anything but guilty. Laboriously did he describe the genesis of the picnic. The prisoner had met Miss Quested at an entertainment given by the principal of government college and had there conceived his intentions concerning her. The prisoner was a man of loose life. as documents found upon him at his arrest would testify. Also, his fellow assistant, Dr. Pannalal, was in a position to throw light on his character, and Major Callender himself would speak. Here, Mr. McBride paused. He wanted to keep the proceedings as clean as possible, but Oriental pathology, his favorite theme, lay around him, and he could not resist it. Taking off his spectacles, as was his habit before enunciating a general truth, he looked into them sadly and remarked that the darker races are physically attracted by the fairer, but not vice versa. Not a matter for bitterness, this, not a matter for abuse, but just a fact which any scientific observer will confirm. It's hilarious. Right? So, it's a scientific fact. And of course, see, Forster is brilliant because he's also picking up on this British predilection towards fact, the fact, the primacy of the fact, empiricism. Right? But now here comes with a bang the next line in this narrative. Right? So this Forster has been describing his McBride's attitude, right? And he has put forward this thesis that, well, Aziz is a darker man, he belongs to the darker races, and we know the nature of Oriental pathology. The darker races are always attracted to the fairer races, never vice versa. And then from somewhere comes this remark, even when the lady is so uglier than the gentleman, right? The comment fell from nowhere, from the ceiling perhaps. It was a first interruption, and the magistrate felt bound to censor it. Turn that man out, he said. One of the native policemen took hold of a man who had said nothing but turned him out roughly. Mr. McBride resumed his spectacles and proceeded. But the comment had upset Miss Quested. Her body resented being called ugly and trembled. So we don't need to go into the rest of the passages because there again we see the nature of the intercourse between the social intercourse between the Indians and the English, but we also get a glimpse into what can be viewed as some of the institutions of British rule, the club, in this case, the courtroom now. Right? So you can also think of you can think also of the novel as being structured not simply along the lines of mosque, caves, temple, but also along the lines of certain kinds of institutions, right? And of these, I have pointed attention to two of them, the club and the courtroom. The difference, of course, was that the club was a place that Indians were excluded from. The court was a space that the Indians mastered. In fact, the Indians mastered it so brilliantly that even though the British, put on this charade of having the trial, and here I speak not only of this trial, but I speak of trials in colonial India, what they had not anticipated was the fact that the colonized would learn the language of the master, so to speak, would take the courtroom, right, and transform that architecture of that courtroom to his own advantage. Right? He would re-territorialize. What the Indian would do would be to re-territorialize the courtroom. So there's a great deal more that can be said, but in conclusion, I think that this is a fantastic read, immensely enjoyable novel. Forster writes with elegance, and he has a sense of humor second to none. Have a good read.